This lecture is given in honour of Eric Watson, who through his own efforts kept the society going through a rough patch when it looked like we were losing more members than we were recruiting, and the society lost its drive. I had drifted into World War I aviation via building models. I tried airfix kits but could never get a biplane to work, and I discovered Aurora kits. Their larger scale enabled me to build something that at least looked like a World War I aeroplane. I found Quentin Reynolds lay forth for the sky at my local newsagent and spent the morning in the front seat of my father's car in the sun reading it. I consumed it, and it set me on my World War I aviation journey. I saw a poster at the old Hobbyco in George Street that had some real World War I photographs attached to it. I contacted Mr. Toohey, but heard nothing more. Then I received a phone call one evening talking to me about a meeting to get together to discuss setting up the World War I Aviation Society in Sydney. I was at the pre-meeting where we agreed that Australia needed its own society, not just be a chapter of the US Cross and Cockade Society. The first meeting was held at Bill Toohey's home at Dundas, and the second at my home in Waverley. After that, we had the monthly meetings at the Railway Institute Central. You youngsters cannot remember this time when we had so little to work with. Some articles in Aero Modeler, the story of the aces in Cavalier magazines, plus a few nudes, and the odd magazine article in aviation magazines. My favourite at the time was the RAF Flying Review. It was an eye-opener when Bill Toohey brought out the US journal Cross and Cockade. It was all new to us. I'm not sure when Eric joined the society, but it was early as I was still living in Sydney at the time. Eric was there when one of the members found this little magazine at a news kiosk down at the railway. We immediately left the meeting and all ran out the kiosk and purchased every copy. This was considered a great buy at the time. The Society's journal started out as a cassette and printed magazine. We did not come up with a great title like Cross and Cockade. I wanted something like the title The Pulse, but we can never agree, and so its flat title without any reference to any aeronautical theme remains. We did not have the resources to produce a proper magazine like the US one. However, we tried all sorts of tricks, including photographs, drawings, etc., so that we had something of value to offer members who could not attend the meetings. I left to work in the bush and stayed in rural municipality engineering until my retirement. During this period, the society fell into the doldrums. It was only Eric who kept it going, with his continual efforts to attract members, get material for the journal, make sure it was printed and distributed, and all those little things that keep a society going but nobody wants to know about. It was Eric who saw the society through that crisis. We have him to thank today when the society is still functioning and seems to be as healthy as it ever was. That being said, I now present this year's Eric Watson Memorial Talk. The Short brothers, there were three, Horace, Eustace, and Oswald. Let's see how I get this thing to work. Horace, Eustace, and Oswald. This is going to be a problem, I can see. In this presentation, we'll delve into the lives and times of these three brothers who boldly ventured into the fledgling field of heavy-air marine aviation. We navigate through their groundbreaking journey for years preceding World War I to the tumultuous 1920s, during which they resourcefully diversified the company to manufacturing bus carriages to withstand economic hardship. This session offers not a merely historical account, but also tries to bring an intimate exploration of the men behind the legend. There is little published on the men. I have drawn on from what sources I could find to try and give the humanity of the men themselves. From pioneering the aviation industry to the brink of bankruptcy, yet surviving, the Short brothers' journey serves as an inspirational tale of innovation and adaptability. Horace was born in 1869. He was described as grotesquely handsome. He suffered a head injury as a child that led to meningitis and an abnormal brain development, but superior intellect. But at the cost of an enlarged forehead. This led to the cruel nickname Bonce. Bonce was a nickname for one's head when I was a kid, so they're just saying he had a big head. Horace was a mathematical genius and showed his ability with mathematics at an early age, exceeding that of the master of his local school. Horace was no wimp. His love of adventure led him to work his way to Australia on a sailing ship. He claimed later that he'd been shipwrecked and imprisoned by Samoan islanders. We know he certainly reached China and later the USA before going to Mexico, where he managed a silver mine. He had journeyed in Africa and was said to long for the peace that could be found in the wild and untainted air of great solitudes. Horace was a man of fertile, fresh, and great ideas and a master builder. He was also known to be stubborn, and when he said no, not even the Admiralty could argue with him. He was the inspirational genius who led the development of seaplanes and other types, but the sense of responsibility he held towards the pilots and exacting care he took in construction of his aeroplanes helped to make East Church free of accidental deaths in those pre-war days. Albert, who will always be known as Eustace, was born in 1877. Then we had Oswald. He was Hugh. He was Hugh Short, but was always known as Oswald, born in 1833. But Horace always referred to him as the Kid. Eustace went in search of Horace after the death of the brothers' fathers on the 11th of December 1895 and left the family in poverty. He eventually found him in Mexico after a 300-mile trip by donkey. Oswald recorded that Horace gave Eustace £500 and promised to return to the UK. It was Eustace's love of ballooning being the catalyst that led to the formation of the company. He had seen a balloon and had incurred the family's displeasure by attempting at the age of 16 of trying to bribe a professional balloonist to take him up, a plot which failed mainly under the smallness of bribe. He eventually purchased a second-hand balloon and managed to extend its life, making a sense for exhibition purpose. He would take the youngest brother with him on these flights. While there's a demand for balloons, Eustace looked after this side of the company's business and the company's involvement in the British Rigid Airship program that never got off the ground in the war years. The firm became involved with the R-32, R-37 and R-38 in 1918. Serious ballooning ended with the end of the war, and he began to seek new interests. He became interested in flying and would accompany the test pilot Lancaster Parker on every flight, be it a prototype or a straightforward flight. Oswald was in charge until Horace's death in 1917. The Kid now came into his own. Eustace was caught up in the LTA side of the business with observation balloons, coastal airships for anti-submarine work. It is difficult to disentangle the share which each brother brought to the enterprise. In the early days, Horace supplied the engineering skill, while Oswald was always a good judge of design. Eustace brought ideas and enthusiastic application where the difficulties or opposition had to be overcome. The Journal of Flight recorded that Eustace was usually reticent to the point of shyness. He was a quiet, unassuming man who was never discouraged. His courage was showed by his many balloon flights, and when he crashed after alighting, he continued to fly. Eustace and Oswald became interested in ballooning after they saw one floating overhead somewhere around 1901. They formed a Showman aeronaut business, and in 1902 they made their first balloon. They were not financially viable until they answered an advertisement in the Times for contracts for war balloons for the Indian government. And to their surprise, they won the contract in 1903 and delivered them in January 1904. The superintendent of the balloon factory at Farnborough, Colonel Templar, came to inspect their balloons past them, and he recommended them to the UK, the British Aero Club. Horace did return to the UK, but was not enamoured of ballooning. He made 2 ascents, but considered it dangerous. Horace did design a pressurised cabin for Eustace and gave the Aeronautical Society a lecture on his invention on the 12th of July 1904, while he pursued other activities. It was quite smart. He made an early record machine that would take your voice and put it on a tape, sort of similar to the gramophone we have today, but it's very early. The contract for the Indian balloons led to the members of the Aero Club, later the Royal Aero Club, becoming aware of the brothers' work, and orders were received from people such as the Honourable C.S. Rolls, Frank McLean, and others. Due to their good workmanship, the firm of Short Brothers Aeronautical Engineers was appointed as balloon makers to the club. In those days, balloons alone offered the only means of flight. Balloon racing became a popular sport. There were international balloon races such as the Gordon Bender Trophy Race. The brothers had tried, unsuccessfully, to build aeroplanes designed by members of the Aero Club. After the Wright's success in achieving powered flight and the eventual trip to Europe in 1908, where Wilbur demonstrated the Wright flyer to great acclaim in France, Eustace had a flight with Wright, and this led to the decision that heavier-than-air machine was the way of the future, and they must make aeroplanes. The 2 younger brothers had been appointed as aeronautical engineers to the club in October 1908, when the club needed someone to guide them on powered flight. Not that the brothers knew much either. Wilbur Wright selected the brothers to build 6 Model A flyers, the United Kingdom's first batch construction. They determined they needed the engineering experience of Horace, and Oswald was set to put the proposition to him. So the 3 brothers joined forces, formed a partnership around late December 1908 or early January 1909. They erected a new factory on the island of Sheppey with an adjacent open area for flying. This is generally accepted as the first factory in the United Kingdom and possibly the world erected for the sole purpose of making aeroplanes commercial sale. As there were no planes available, the brothers had to make their own from an examination and measurements of the Wright biplane. As I mentioned before, these were not the first aircrafts that Shorts built. A few years previously, they built a glider for Mr. Paul Brabazon, later Lord Brabazon. They also built a powered aircraft for Mr. Frank McLean. Frank McLean was to have a dramatic effect on Shorts in the Royal Naval Air Service. In 1911, the first 4 British naval officers to undergo a naval aviation course received their first tuition in the theory and practice of aviation at the firm's works at Eastchurch. And since that date, Eastchurch became a centre for naval aviation in the United Kingdom. This was due to Frank McLean making his aircraft available for the RN to train their men at no cost to the Navy. And if you want to know, that's an excellent book, biography of Frank McLean, written by Phil Jarrett, the noted author, and I recommend it. There were 4 officers: Charles Sampson, Reginald Gregory, Arthur Longmore from the Royal Navy, and Eugene Gerard from the Royal Marines. Horace gave the men technical instruction. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Longmore was one of the 4 RN men who learned at Eastchurch. Horace was responsible for their technical instruction. Longmore found Horace a most interesting character. He had been in all parts of the world in some engineering adventure of one sort or another. In the small tin-roofed shanty that served as our officers' mess, he would sit to the small hours, sipping his neat whisky and regaling us with stories of his various experiences. The appointment of Sampson as the officer in charge of naval aviation contingent led to closest links being established between Sampson and Short Brothers. Sampson tried to develop naval aviation, seeking to understand how aircraft and ships could work together. Sampson was a hands-on type. He had the public support of the then First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. In 1912, Sampson made the first takeoff of an aircraft from a British ship in a short biplane. Staging was erected on the deck of the HMS Africa. The ship was moored in Sheerness Harbour. This was followed by Sampson taking off with a platform erected on HMS Hibernia while underway at sea. The aircraft was a short land plane fitted with flotation bags. Short's work served them well in constructing light airbags for flotation. Although aircraft builders, Shorts did not give up their balloon activities. They designed and made the cover 66,000 square feet and 15 of the 17 gas bags for the British airship, the Mayfly. And that name as the machine never flew, breaking its back when taken out of its floating shed after numerous modifications trying to get it to fly. Horace invented the short patent folding wing mechanism that enabled float planes to be able to stowed on board ships and led to the aircraft carrier. That is, a ship that carried aircraft. These would be lifted out of the hold, wings unfolded, made ready for flight, hoisted over the side for takeoff. On the lighting, the reverse process will be undertaken. It was to be 1918 until the first flush-deck aircraft carrier was built. Horace always said that the only person who paid money for his patent to fold the wings was paid by Tom Sopwith for an amount of about £20, even though other manufacturers went on to use them. The most famous British float plane of World War I was the Short 184. This machine's fame was due to it undertaking a successful torpedo attack, flying during the Battle of Jutland, and serving in every theatre that the British were involved of in World War I and in the Russian Revolution of 1918-1919, and then in several air forces post-war. The Admiralty 184 type was not conceived as a torpedo carrier, but was modified by Horace from the design of a typical short seaplane that utilised the largest engine then available, the 225 horsepower Sunbeam. It received the serial 184 and hence its name under the incomprehensible Navy naming scheme then in force. As you can see here, the 184 had a long career. After the war, it served in Estonia. The Short 320 was the first British aircraft designed from the start as a torpedo carrier. If not the first, then it was definitely the first single-engine aircraft. It never dropped a torpedo in anger, but was to serve throughout the war. Murray Suter was in the Aegean and put forward a proposal that was adopted. The Short 320s were to be towed by motor launches out to sea, where they would be released to take off and attack the Austro-Hungarian fleet in their harbour at Pola. This was attempted on the 2nd of September 1917. It was a combined British, French and Italian effort. Unfortunately, a sudden squall led to the abandonment of the attack. For reasons unknown, it was not attempted again. It would have been quite interesting to have what happened in the Second World War, it would have happened in the First World War. The Short bomber. The Admiralty wanted a single-engine bomber to fill in the gap until the Handley Page 0100 was available. As the white 840 bomber would not be ready for some months, Horace chose to take a shortcut and mount the fuselage of the 184 float plane on a Langley land undercarriage, the bomber. It required longer wings to carry its anticipated load. It was now that John Lancaster Parker came in contact with Shorts. The young man, about 20 at the time, had flown multiple types. He applied for the job as test pilot at Shorts, and he got the job on 3 months' trial. But he was told by the works manager that Mr. Short had told him on no account would that bit of a boy be allowed to test a bomber. After a week, Parker fronted up the Short, handing him a note with his notice. He was received with courtesy and a beaming smile. Acres of it seemed, for he had that colossal head. Horace told him to go and try to fall bombers and break his bloody neck. He then got into his car and drove away, ostensibly to avoid the coming catastrophe, but to avoid Parker's embarrassment. This was Parker's big chance, and he did not fail. He found Horace a very kindly and highly strung man. On one occasion, Horace flung him to the ground and covered him with his body. A dazed Parker was helped to his feet to find Horace is in an aeroplane in apparent difficulty and thought it was going to crash. He'd pushed Parker down so he would not see the tragedy. In the event, the craft recovered and all was well. Horace had a temper, and when it arose, he would throw his hat on the ground and stomp on it. Horace had kept the length of the fuselage of the bomber the same as that of the 184. There we see the original. Here we see how it was lengthened. Horace had kept the length of the fuselage that of the 184. Unfortunately, it was too short and longitudinally unstable, or its longitudinal stability was marginal. Horace's obstinacy came to the fore, and he refused to acknowledge he was wrong. So Ronald Kent, then the Short Chief Test Pilot at that time, and Commander Longmore of the Royal Naval Air Service, conspired to have the fuselage lengthened while Horace was away. They spliced an extra 8 foot 6 inches into the fuselage behind the rear cockpit. This improved stability and was officially adopted. Now the pair awaited the wrath of the master. When they saw Horace, they were surprised to learn that he worked all night on the new fuselage and was happy that the calculations showed it was okay and the expected blow-up did not occur. Horace remained in charge until his death in 1917. C.S. Ferry wrote that when he joined Short Brothers, he had the privilege of working with the greatest engineer I have ever met, Horace Short, a man who can truly be described as a genius, who taught me more than I ever learnt in college or elsewhere. On his death, the Daily Mail reported, "The human dynamo has run down." Eustace. Eustace was caught up in the LTA side of the business with his observation balloons, coastal airships, anti-submarine work, and the British rigid airship program. Eustace also supervised the Cardigan project, where the large airship sheds were being built. Once Short left LTA, Eustace became a sort of a spare wheel. His residences from 1918 to 28 were convenient to London office, but not for a company located in Rochester. In 1925, he determined to learn to fly. And although some thought it unwise for a man of 50 to take up flying, over 50 I should say, Eustace was one never to turn away from a task he had set his mind to, and fly he did. He would fly the Short muscle light sporting twin float seaplane regularly. He was flying his machine when he died of a heart attack, 8th of April 1932. He had just alighted, made a perfect lighting, and didn't have time to switch off the engines. When they went out the machine to wonder why it was just sitting there with the engine ticking over, they found him dead in his seat. He was still pursuing high-altitude flight balloons at the time of his death. It is difficult to disentangle the share each brother brought to the enterprise. The journal Flight recorded that Eustace was usually reticent to point of shyness, quite unassuming man who was never discouraged. The company in 1918. In 1918, Short went in building seaplanes to building de Havilland 9 bombers and the Felixstowe F-3 flying boat and the license. Decision must have been made somewhere by someone before March 1918 to take seaplane construction away from Short's. Why did this happen? Was it that Short's did not come up with any new seaplanes worth building? Or was it that their facilities was considered better for building more types that were urgently needed? However, the de Havilland 9 was to prove a major disappointment at the front. It was a tragedy that the Rolls-Royce DH4 was taken out of the line and the de Havilland 9 substituted. But that is another story. Oswald was the company's authority on seaplane faults. The first aircraft that Oswald designed without the input of his older brother was the N2B. This small float plane had the 260 horsepower Sunbeam engine, and its performance was not sufficient to better existing types to warrant production onset. The machine had been designed for a Rolls-Royce engine, and when Oswald was able to borrow one post-war, the result was, as Lancaster Parker recorded, extraordinary. He had the quickest takeoff of any seaplane I have known, something under 5 seconds, and it climbed easily to 16,000 feet with full load. If the right engine had been available, then it might have had a service career. However, it was always engines that limited the types that could be produced. The British have an unenviable record of selecting the wrong aero engines to produce in the later years of World War I. Horace's death in 1917 could have influenced the powers to be to give Shorts an interim program until they sorted themselves out. Oswald was not considered by the British Admiralty the same as Horace. This is confirmed in a document relating to Short's design of a flying boat to meet the N3 specifications. Up to this design, all Short's experience had been associated with floatplanes. It is doubtful the design of the machine Mr. Oswald Short has sufficient technical knowledge for us to rely solely on his firm to produce the only experimental machine of such an important type. The authorities looked to Vickers, who had only the early gun bus design had gone into quantity production, but they had built the Vimies, which was to come into production at the end of the war, but it never established itself under post-war. Vickers designed their N3 flying boat. Of the 3 Vickers N3 boats, the first forced landed on its delivery flight, stove in the bottom, and never flew again. The second N3 from Vickers, tailplane failed in flight and the machine crashed. It never flew again either. But the third did survive from March 1923 to November 24. Short had a contract for 3 N3 Cometry flying boats. This was their first flying boat of their own design that Short's built. Number N120 was completed by December 18, went to the seaplane's developmental flight in July 1919. In 1922, it went on a cruise around the coast of the UK. Unfortunately, it was beached at St. Mary's on the Isle of Sicily. Considered beyond economic repair, it was broken up. The last 2 machines were cancelled. Whether this was due to the N3 series being considered not worthy pursuing or just a cometry is unknown. Also, from 1917, there had been discussions that flying boats could take the place of seaplanes, and in 1918, that land planes could take the place of both. This argument continued under the armistice, but with peace. Afterwards, all 3 types were recognised as having a function to play and were developed during the interwar years. It was not until the long-range consolidated Liberator became available to Coastal Command that land planes took over the major role of anti-submarine patrolling in World War II. Backwards, sorry about that. There's our short chronometry. The Silver Streak. In 1920, Oswald had a small biplane on display at the Olympia Aero Show. This machine was a stress-skinned construction and was built entirely of metal. It was the end product of Oswald's design for a fighter of similar construction that he designed in 1918 but could not get official permission to build. The government eventually bought the Silver Streak but never flew it, instead tested it to determine its strength. This was from the man who they didn't consider had the quality to actually build a flying boat. The Felixstowe F3 was to be the first flying boat to be built by Shorts. Oswald Short held that Porter, the original of the Felixstowe series of flying boats, had a bias against float planes and preferred flying boats, which is probably true. But Port was trying to build a craft that was suitable for the North Sea, could also hold its own in aerial combat. The British never achieved a seaplane flying boat fighter, unlike the Germans or the Austro-Hungarians. That's a post-war advertisement from Short Brothers. Postscript. The short story continued through the uncertain years of the 1920s and 1930s under Oswald's leadership. They built bus bodies under the RAF and Imperial Airways accepted stretch-skin construction. Short Empire flying boats and the Sterling bombers. When war commenced in 1939, Short was there with Sunderland flying boats. Oswald was a quiet, unassuming, courteous man. His courage had been tested by his balloon flights and his acting as observer test flights. He was a lover of music and animals and had a Victorian paternal approach to labour relations. His health failed due to the stresses of the 1930s and the early war years. When the government expropriated shareholders of Shorts in 1943, he resigned. He never overcame his bitterness that the company had been taken over into public ownership to safeguard aircraft production. Sir Stamford Cripps seemed to have had an aversion to Shorts. There were problems with the factory, but so were problems with many of the other British wartime factories. Cripps wanted Shorts to manufacture Lancasters instead of Sterlings. Shorts never made a Lancaster, and the Sterling remained in production till the end of the war, as it was wanted as a glider tug and parachute transport. A lot of this information has come from Gordon Bruce, who was the unofficial historian at Shorts. He was the Shorts secretary. And he provided me with a lot of this information. And like I said, it's very hard to get behind the characters of the men. We get usually just a gloss over, and then we get into the aircraft and what they did at the front. So I hope that this small story will encourage some of you to actually research the men behind the men from the front. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Colin. That was most informative. I'm sure, like everyone else here, I learned a lot. Quite a lot that I didn't know about the story behind the story. So we're indebted to you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, that's it.
Questions.
Oh, sorry. Questions, Colin.
Yeah, question time.
Have a seat, Colin.
Sorry about that.
I know this is a post-war development of Short Brothers, but there's a link. Production went to Northern Ireland, Belfast, after the war at some stage, and they built the Short Belfast RAF transport plane and also the Shorts commuter aircraft. I was just wondering if you knew about the way they moved to Northern Ireland until recent years.
No, I know nothing about that. I'm sorry.
I have a friend who worked for Short Brothers, so I could probably find out the work is not too open.
Colin, there's Byrne put in the newsletter a link to the website that does the Shorts history. And I think they were saying that Belfast was a World War II dispersion of production.
Right.
And it's quite a complicated story because the British government had it in for Shorts.
Yeah, that's
Well, Stamford Cripps certainly had in for him.
Yeah, but the company that continued basically was in government ownership.
Yeah, and the thing was, for what the Short Brothers did, they never received any official recognition. Like none of them made Sirs, Oswald Short or whatever.
There must have been somebody outside.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, you've got Sir Richard Ferry. He came through Shorts. When he left Shorts, he was given up. I don't know if he was given, but he took a whole set of plans that he based his first seaplane on.
Arthur Longmore, is he Australian?
I couldn't tell you offhand.
Just in 1943, sometime during the Second World War, it was considered for appointment as chief of the East for the RWA. To replace George Kennedy.
I don't think they would have sent us an Australian. It would be British, I like. Again, I don't know the story, but yeah, it'd be interesting to find out.
Colin, the short Sunderland, where does that fit in?
Well, the Short Empire flying boats led to the design of the Short Sunderland, and they were being built like, if the number 10 squadron had them. Yeah, number 10 had them, and they went to the UK and were testing it, and then they getting to know them, but flying back to Australia, and the war broke out, and they stayed there for the rest of the war.
Second slide.
Bulgarin was in charge, wasn't he? Bulgarin?
Yeah.
He went over with them anyway, and yeah,
Aaron was there for a while, so it was with M Squadron.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a second son was it was 461. Yeah.
he was a lovely man, though. He's funny to talk to.
A long walk from the board in Manly, New South Wales.
Okay,
Thank you.
very good.
We seem to have a second group here. Should make a bit of noise.
Just an observation as we're looking at a short Stirling, which I realise has nothing to do with our society whatsoever except the name. But I remember talking to a bloke who learned to fly on Stirlings and then went on to Lancaster.
Yep.
I said, so what was it like flying both and what was the difference? And he said the greatest difference from his viewpoint was the fact that Stirling had twin tail wheels, and he just found it a bit difficult during the land phase compared to the Lancaster, because the Lancaster was a lot more maneuverable and in many ways, but it was a better aircraft.
It's a later aircraft too.
Progression, so they're not only using for, as you said, for the parachute operations and paraglider, but also for training in the preparation stage, the heavy bomber version to lead into their places.
With the
A minor anecdote.
with the DFC biographies I'm doing for the Australian War Memorial, yeah, you're right. The number of guys who trained on Stirlings in Lancaster is quite remarkable.
Middleton BC.
Here's a Stirling.
I read that, this is from memory, but there was an RAF squadron, I think it was number 30, who operated Stirlings in Bombercan, who had the highest casualty rating RAF squadron, because Stirlings could only operate about 5,000 feet lower than the other bombers in the main force. So they'd be picked off fairly easily. But yes, they were cut down to 50%. And I think the retail story, they the feed didn't stay in the hand. They like it the size of the hand.
It gives you the story about logistics and think about you fit something to fit what you've got, rather than fit unfortunately.
But the wife will be
I think we're finished.
I think we finished.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.